Mount Everest. The very name evokes a mixture of awe and terror. For centuries, it has stood as a symbol of both human triumph and tragedy, an inescapable reminder of the fragility of life when confronted by nature's raw power. For those who dare attempt the climb, it is a journey toward personal glory, but at what cost? Few survive the brutal ascent to the top, and fewer still return without having been irrevocably changed by what they experienced on the mountain. This story begins with one such expedition, a seemingly routine ascent that would quickly spiral into the kind of nightmare no one had ever imagined. The team of climbers was diverse, seasoned mountaineers with years of experience under their belts. Yet none of them had faced the unique dangers that Mount Everest harbored in its frozen embrace. There was Thomas, the lead climber, a man whose passion for the mountain had consumed him over the years, and with that passion, an unshakable confidence. His companions were equally seasoned. Maya, a sharp-witted medic who had helped countless climbers in the past, Jordan, a quiet but determined engineer with a technical mind, and Alex, a relatively new climber, eager to prove himself, but secretly haunted by doubts. Together, they formed a team of 4, bound by a common goal: to summit Everest and become part of the exclusive group of climbers who had conquered the world's highest peak. At the start, everything appeared normal. The weather was cooperative, the skies clear, and the climb up the mountain's base camp was an uneventful one. They had spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, double-checking their equipment, and assessing the risks. Their plan was straightforward: ascend, summit, and descend. But as they approached the higher reaches of the mountain, something began to shift, though it was subtle enough to dismiss at first. The first sign of trouble came during their ascent to Camp I. The temperature dropped sharply, not just in degrees, but in an unnatural way. Even the cold, which the team had expected, seemed somehow more intense, more biting. Their breath began to freeze in the air, and the snow, which had previously been powdery and soft, now seemed to freeze with a strange consistency that made every step an ordeal. Maya, the medic, felt a tightening in her chest, a discomfort that she initially attributed to the altitude. But there was something more insidious lurking in the air, something that neither of them could quite place. As the team reached higher altitudes, the effects of the mountain began to take hold in more unsettling ways. The landscape itself began to feel wrong. The snowfields stretched endlessly, and the wind howled in ways that sounded like distant whispers. At first, it was just a trick of the mind, a figment of fatigue, or the isolation that comes with such an arduous journey. But soon, Thomas began to hear it too, the whispers in the wind. They weren't words, not exactly, but something akin to them, a quiet murmur that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with the gusts. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but a creeping unease began to gnaw at his resolve. On the third day of their ascent, something truly strange happened. Jordan, who had been handling the navigation, reported that their compass had gone haywire. It was spinning in circles, erratically, refusing to point in any direction. The GPS systems in their equipment began malfunctioning too, displaying coordinates that didn't align with their location. The team stopped to recheck their bearings, but no matter what they did, they couldn't make sense of the data. There was a sinking feeling that began to form in Thomas's gut, but he chose to push forward, assuring the team that it was a simple malfunction. "We're close," he said, trying to steady their nerves. "We're almost there." However, their progress slowed as the day wore on. The air became thinner, and each step became a monumental effort. They had expected this, of course, but there was something more about the mountain this time, something that felt different from previous climbs. It wasn't just the physical toll it was taking on them. It was as if the mountain itself was resisting their progress. The wind picked up in furious gusts, howling louder and louder, drowning out the world around them. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and they huddled in their tents, trying to find warmth in the bitter cold. But sleep would not come easily that night. When Thomas awoke the next morning, he found something truly disturbing. The team's supply bags had been moved. They had been carefully arranged the night before, but now, the packs were scattered as if they had been tossed about by a force they couldn't comprehend. None of them had left their tents during the night, So who, or what, had moved them? The paranoia began to creep in. Alex suggested that they had been too exhausted and must have moved the packs in their sleep, but even he wasn't convinced. There was a palpable shift in the air that morning, as if the mountain itself had decided to test them. As they continued their ascent, strange things began to happen. The landscape seemed to blur, and for the briefest of moments, they thought they had seen a figure in the distance, tall, pale, and silent. They stopped to look, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. This sighting was soon followed by a constant sense of being watched, of someone lurking just out of sight. The team tried to brush it off, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave them. The expedition was only beginning, but the mountain was already beginning to toy with their minds. What started as a routine climb was fast turning into something far darker. The cold wasn't just physical anymore, it was creeping into their souls. The whispers in the wind had grown louder. Something on this mountain was not right. And it wasn't just the mountain that had changed, it was them. The second day, after the strange occurrences at camp, I had left the team unsettled. But there was no turning back. Mount Everest was unforgiving, and with the summit looming just ahead, the pull of the challenge was too great. The mountain, however, had begun to show its true face, and what had started as a physical test was rapidly becoming something far more insidious. A battle not just against the elements, but against the unknown. The team trudged forward, each step heavier than the last, the snow beneath their boots seeming to shift in unnatural ways, as if the mountain itself were alive, watching them, waiting. The wind howled with a voice that seemed to carry words, too indistinct to understand but clear enough to unsettle. Maya, the medic, had begun to feel more than just the altitude sickness she had expected. Her mind, already strained by the physical demands of the climb, was starting to play tricks on her. Late in the night, after another grueling day, she sat up in her tent, heart racing. The wind had died down for a moment, and in that silence, she could hear something else, something faint, like a voice, but too distant to be clear. She tried to shake the feeling, telling herself it was just her mind, exhausted and weary from the climb. But there was no denying the feeling that something, or someone, was calling to her from the vast, white emptiness outside. It wasn't just Maya. Jordan, the engineer, had also noticed something strange as they made their way through a narrow crevasse later that day. He had seen a flash of movement at the edge of his vision, a figure, tall and thin, standing against the sheer rock face of the mountain. When he turned his head, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of snow. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, the mirage of exhaustion, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. His breath quickened, his pace quickened, and yet the feeling persisted, as if the mountain was drawing him deeper into its cold embrace. The team began to distance themselves emotionally, not just from the mountain, but from each other. The isolation was growing unbearable, and while they spoke to one another out of necessity, the words felt hollow. Alex, the newest member of the group, was the first to openly acknowledge it. "Something's wrong," he said one evening, his voice barely more than a whisper as they gathered around their small campfire. "I don't know what it is, but I feel like we're not alone." Thomas, the leader, tried to dismiss it. He was the one who had led the team into this frozen wilderness, and he would not allow doubt to creep in. "This is what the mountain does to you," he replied firmly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It plays with your mind. You gotta push past it. We're close." But even he could feel the weight of the words. As the climb continued, the tension between them grew. The mountain was no longer just an obstacle to conquer. It was a presence that loomed over them, oppressive and unyielding. The whispers in the wind seemed to follow them, rising and falling like a chorus, and each night, the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was as though the mountain itself was shifting, changing, adapting, and every step they took brought them closer to something they couldn't see but could feel in their bones. The snow, once pure and white, began to take on a strange, ominous hue. It wasn't the blood red of a warning, but something far subtler, a pale, sickly blue that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Mai noticed it first. She had stepped out of her tent in the middle of the night, trying to clear her head, when she saw the snow shift in the light of the campfire. The blue light was faint but unmistakable, and for a moment, it seemed to pulse, as though the earth itself was breathing beneath them. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just the cold playing tricks on her, but when she looked again, the snow had returned to its normal whiteness. But she wasn't the only one who saw it. Jordan had witnessed it too, although he said nothing, unsure of how to voice what he had felt. On the fourth day, the team began to notice that the path had changed. The way forward no longer seemed clear. They had been following the same route they had planned on their maps, yet it no longer aligned with their expectations. The peaks and ridges that should have been visible in the distance were obscured by fog, and even their GPS seemed to spiral out of control, constantly recalibrating to points they couldn't understand. It was as though the mountain had begun to rearrange itself, to bend reality to its will. Their ascent, once methodical and steady, now felt like an endless series of dead ends and false paths. Alex was the first to panic. He had been clutching the ropes and climbing gear tightly, trying to focus on the next step, but suddenly, it felt like the ground beneath him was giving way. He looked back and shouted to the others, but when they turned, the path they had just come from was no longer there. It had vanished, replaced by a sheer, almost impossible rock face. The tracks they had left in the snow had disappeared as though they had never been there. "This isn't right," Alex muttered, his voice trembling. "We're going in circles." The others tried to reassure him, but there was no denying the truth of his words. Something was wrong, and the further they ascended, the less they understood the rules of the mountain. The snowstorm that had started out as a light flurry now intensified, reducing their visibility to near zero. The wind began to scream louder, and once again, those haunting whispers filled the air, growing clearer, sharper. The voices were no longer distant echoes. They were right next to them, swirling in the snow, brushing against their skin. It was at that moment, when the mountain seemed to come alive in a terrifying crescendo of sound and movement, that the team realized they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The line between reality and the unknown had blurred, and the true nature of Mount Everest, a place of ancient and unfathomable power, was beginning to reveal itself. They weren't just climbing a mountain anymore, they were being drawn into a trap. The wind howled louder, and Maya, unable to shake the sense of dread that had settled deep in her chest, spoke for the first time in hours. "We need to get off this mountain. Now!" But no one responded. They were all looking at the same thing. The snow, glowing faintly blue, swirling around them, as if to encircle them in its icy grip. They had come to Everest for glory, but what awaited them now was far more sinister. The whispers were louder than ever, and this time, they were not just carried by the wind. They were coming from within the snow itself. By the time the team reached the edge of the glacier, it was clear that something far more dangerous than just the physical environment was at play. They were no longer navigating the mountain with the clarity of purpose they had brought with them. Instead, they were stumbling through a nightmare, each step forward feeling like a surrender to an unknown force. The eerie blue glow in the snow persisted, and the whispers had intensified into a maddening cacophony, filling the air around them. The voices, once distant and vague, now felt like a presence that hovered just behind them, speaking in hushed tones, their words indistinct but their intent unmistakable. The mountain was alive, and it was watching them. Thomas, the leader, had always prided himself on his ability to keep calm under pressure, but now, his composure was unraveling. His gaze was vacant, his hands shaking as he gripped the map they had been following. He'd studied this route for months, had planned each segment with precision, but now nothing seemed familiar. The landscape had shifted, changed in ways that defied logic. Peaks that had been clearly visible just hours ago were now hidden behind dense clouds. The trail they had been following had evaporated into the snow, leaving them standing at a precipice with no clear direction. "We need to go down," Maya suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Her face, pale and strained, reflected the fear that gripped her. She had been trying to convince herself that they could make it to the summit, but her instincts now screamed that they needed to leave. "We're losing time, and if we don't start descending, we're not going to make it out of here alive." The words hit the group like a slap, but they knew deep down that she was right. The mountain wasn't just testing them anymore, it was trying to trap them. The air had grown colder, the wind sharper, and the light of day seemed to be slipping away faster than it should have. They had only a few more hours of daylight left, but the sky was darkening as though night had come early. Each glance at the horizon revealed no landmarks, no sign of the way back to base camp. It was as though the entire world had swallowed them whole, leaving them stranded in a vast, indifferent void. "Down it is," Thomas finally muttered, his voice hollow. He knew it wasn't just the weather or the lack of a visible trail that made him hesitate. It was the growing sense that the mountain itself was closing in on them, pushing them into a corner. The team had been conditioned to handle danger, but they were not prepared for this. The oppressive weight of the unknown that seemed to claw at their sanity. As they began their descent, the ground beneath them shifted in unsettling ways. The snow, which had once been firm and reliable, now felt spongy, unstable. Each step seemed to sink deeper than the last, as if they were walking on the surface of some vast, invisible chasm. Their crampons sank into the snow, but the ice below felt different. It had an unnatural give, as if it were made of something other than solid ice. Something more alive, something that responded to their movements, watching them with an unseen eye. The further they descended, the more they felt the mountain pushing back, its pressure mounting on them, forcing them to confront their vulnerability. The team was now scattered, each member consumed by their thoughts, their fear. Maya, once the calm center of the group, had become distant, her gaze locked on the ground as she tried to navigate the sinking snow. Jordan, usually the one with an analytical mind, was visibly agitated. His eyes darted around, as though he were trying to locate the source of the whispers that followed them. But the whispers had changed. They no longer seemed to come from the wind or the snow. They were inside their minds, thoughts interspersed with words, suggestions, urgings. "Don't trust him. He's hiding something." The words echoed in Jordan's head, and he spun around to face the others. But no one had spoken. They were all still moving, focused on the descent. Still, the voice lingered in his mind. The tension between the team members was palpable, each person lost in their own spiraling thoughts. The weight of the isolation and the mountain's oppressive presence slowly unraveling their trust in each other. Alex, who had been the most vocal about the strange occurrences, had become unervingly quiet. He was no longer asking questions or trying to understand the bizarre events that had unfolded. Instead, he seemed withdrawn, his eyes hollow and distant, his movements mechanical. When Thomas spoke to him, there was no response. Alex was there in body, but his mind had clearly been consumed by something else. As they continued their descent, a strange fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, obscuring their vision. The world around them seemed to fade into nothingness, the edges of the mountain disappearing into an inky black void. Even their breaths seemed to be swallowed by the dense air. It was a disorienting, suffocating experience, and the once clear path down the glacier now felt like an endless maze. "We need to stop," Maya said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right. I feel like we're being led somewhere. It's like the mountain's pulling us in." But no one responded. They were moving on instinct now, their minds disjointed and feverish. Their bodies moved mechanically, each footstep slower and more deliberate than the last. It felt as if they were trapped in a dream, unable to wake up, unable to escape. The fog seemed to close in around them, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Thomas stopped abruptly. His eyes scanned the fog, then fixed on a shadow that had emerged from the mist. A figure, tall and thin, barely discernible in the haze. It was standing motionless, staring at them. There was no sound except for the wind, no explanation, just the figure, watching them from the edge of their vision. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it one of the team members? No. This figure was different. It wasn't human. "Get away from it," Maya gasped, her voice breaking. But Thomas, entranced by the sight, could not move. The figure remained, unmoving, until it disappeared into the fog, just as suddenly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was deafening. The fog seemed to lift slightly, but the unease among the team was palpable. They had seen something that was not a part of the mountain, and yet something that seemed to belong to it, something that could never be explained. It was a moment that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had descended, yes, but into what? Into madness? Into something far darker than they could ever understand? The answers were just out of reach, lost in the growing shadows of Everest. And in that moment, they realized, with chilling clarity, that the mountain was not just a place. It was a force, a presence, one that would not let them leave unchanged. As the fog began to dissipate, the oppressive weight of silence descended on the team like a heavy cloak. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of life itself. The mountain, once a majestic and daunting force, now felt like an oppressive, suffocating entity. The strange figure, its fleeting presence in the fog, seemed to have shattered the tenuous grip on reality that the group had managed to maintain. Thomas, Maya, Jordan, and the others stood motionless, their breath shallow and labored, their eyes scanning the desolate landscape. What had they seen? Was it an illusion? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or something more? The team had no answers, but the unspoken question loomed between them. Was it safe to continue? Their descent had now become more than just a retreat from danger. It had transformed into a struggle against something intangible, something far darker than the physical threats they had prepared for. Everest, they realized, was no longer merely a mountain to conquer. It was an entity to endure. As they pressed forward, each step felt heavier than the last. The cold no longer seemed like the typical mountain chill. It was as if the very air had thickened, congealing around them, pressing them inward. The silence was unnerving. The usual wind that howled across the slopes, the distant sounds of cracking ice or shifting rocks, these sounds were now gone, replaced by a profound stillness. And in that stillness, the mind begins to betray itself. Maya, usually the voice of reason in times of crisis, was the first to break the silence. "We can't keep moving like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're losing our grip on reality. This place is not just cold. It's wrong." Her words hung in the air, a confession, a realization that each of them had been suppressing, but was now impossible to ignore. They had been descending with the assumption that they would find safety, that the path down would eventually lead them to a familiar refuge. But the mountain seemed to be reshaping itself around them, warping their perception, making them question everything they thought they knew. The ground underfoot was no longer solid, but soft and treacherous, as if the earth itself was pulling them into its depths. Thomas turned to Maya, his face pale, his eyes hollow with a mix of disbelief and fear. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "The pressure? It's like the air is thick, like it's pressing down on us." "It's not just the altitude." Maya nodded, her brow furrowing. She had felt it too, that oppressive weight in the air, as if Everest itself was alive and aware of their every movement. They were not alone here, not in the way they had imagined, but in a deeper, more malevolent sense. The mountain was watching them. It was waiting for them to falter. And falter they did. As the team trudged forward, trying to make sense of the disorienting landscape, they began to notice subtle, yet impossible to ignore changes in their surroundings. The snow, which had once been a uniform white, now seemed to shift colors in the twilight, streaks of red and black appearing in patches, as if stained by some unseen force. Shadows moved where there should have been none, twisting in unnatural angles, stretching toward them with intent. Jordan, who had been lost in thought, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you see that?" he gasped, his voice high-pitched with fear. The others turned to him, their faces drawn with exhaustion, but his words made them freeze. There, in the distance, barely visible through the shifting fog, was the outline of another figure. It was standing perfectly still, just like the one they had seen earlier, but this one was closer. It wasn't just a shadow. It had shape, and it had movement, slow, deliberate, as if it was considering whether or not to approach. The figure, dark and indistinct against the snow, didn't seem to belong to any of them. It wasn't human, at least not in any way they understood. It was an anomaly, an impossible presence in a place already defined by its extreme isolation. "No more hallucinations," Thomas muttered, trying to steady his shaking hands. "We need to stay focused. It's just the altitude, the lack of oxygen. We're all seeing things." But deep down, Thomas knew it wasn't just a trick of the mind. It wasn't the mountain making them see things. It was something else, something that had been waiting for them, something that had been here long before they ever set foot on its frozen slopes. As the team huddled together, trying to regain their composure, the temperature plummeted even further. Their breaths became visible in the air, fogging up in front of them. But the cold didn't come from the atmosphere alone. It emanated from the earth itself, as though the mountain was exhaling a deep, endless frost. The chill penetrated their clothing, seeping into their bones, making it nearly impossible to stay warm. "This is it," Maya said, her voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "We can't keep going. This place isn't just a mountain. It's a tomb, and we're already buried." For the first time since their expedition had begun, there was no argument. No one challenged her words. The group had reached an unspoken consensus. They were trapped. Everest wasn't just an obstacle. They had ventured into something far more sinister. The mountain wasn't just a physical challenge. It was a test of their very souls, a trial of their will to survive. But as they stood there, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming sense of doom, the mountain seemed to respond. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in their minds, filling their thoughts. They were no longer just auditory hallucinations. The whispers had become physical, pressing against their temples, urging them to listen, urging them to understand. "You are mine," the voices whispered as one. "You always were." And then, just as suddenly as the whispers had begun, the mountain seemed to exhale a final, terrible sigh. The air shifted, the temperature dropped to an unimaginable degree, and the shadows around them began to converge. The team was no longer standing on the surface of the mountain. They had crossed into something else, something that was neither life nor death, but a space between. And in that space, they were not just intruders. They were prisoners. The fog that had been swirling around them for hours now seemed to take on a more tangible form. It was as if the mountain itself had become alive, an entity with its own will, and it was making its presence known in ways that defied comprehension. As the team pressed on, the reality they once knew seemed to slip further away. The solid ground underfoot felt unstable, as if the mountain were shifting and moving beneath them. But it wasn't just the terrain that had changed. It was something far more unsettling. Their minds were no longer their own. What had once been a group of capable and determined climbers, united by a shared goal, now seemed to be splintering into isolated individuals, each struggling against the pull of something darker. It was as if the mountain itself was tearing them apart, unraveling the fabric of their sanity. No longer was there a sense of camaraderie. Now, each member of the team felt like a mere echo of their former selves, disconnected and lost. The fog, thick and suffocating, pressed in on them from all sides, as if it were closing off any possible escape. The whispers, those faint murmurs that had first begun in the distance, were now impossible to ignore. They were everywhere, inside their minds, at the edge of their consciousness. At first, they had been subtle, distant voices, perhaps carried on the wind. But now, they were sharp, insistent, demanding their attention. They were no longer a mere disturbance, but a force that could not be denied. Every time they took a step, the whispers grew louder, filling the space between their thoughts, making it harder to distinguish reality from delusion. Maya was the first to break. She had always been the rational one, the steady anchor in times of crisis. But the pressure of the mountain, coupled with the suffocating whispers, had begun to unravel her. She stopped suddenly, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though she were listening to something they couldn't hear. The others, still trailing behind her, noticed her sudden stillness and halted in their tracks. "Maya, what's wrong?" Jordan asked, his voice wavering between concern and fear. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, something they could not see through the dense fog. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. And then, finally, her voice, hoarse and trembling, cut through the silence. "They're calling me. They're telling me to come closer." Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "Maya, we need to keep moving. This isn't real. You're just hearing things. It's the altitude, the lack of oxygen." But Maya jerked away from him, her eyes filled with terror. "No, you don't understand. They want me to come. They know me. They've always known me." Her words didn't make sense, but they didn't need to. The fear in her voice was enough. The others exchanged uneasy glances. What was happening to her? What was happening to all of them? And more importantly, why were they all hearing the same things? It was as if the mountain itself was communicating with them, invading their thoughts, twisting their perceptions. "Let's just keep moving," Jordan said, his voice barely audible. "We can't stay here." They resumed their descent, but the sense of dread had only grown stronger. The weight of the silence was pressing in on them, punctuated by the occasional whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very mountain were pulling them down into its depths. And yet, there was nowhere else to go. The summit was behind them, and the path forward was unclear. Every direction felt like a trap. Every step forward seemed like a step into the unknown. As they walked, Thomas began to feel something else. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense of discomfort, a feeling of being watched. But soon, it became more pronounced. The air was too still, the temperature too cold, and the fog too thick. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. They were being followed, but whenever he turned around, the path was empty. It was as if the mountain itself had become a presence, a sentient force that was observing them, studying them, waiting for something. Jordan, too, had begun to feel the weight of this unseen presence. He had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but it kept coming back. He would glance over his shoulder, convinced that something was lurking in the fog just beyond his vision. But there was nothing there, only the dense mist, the endless expanse of white. The mountain was changing them. It was manipulating them, twisting their minds into knots. It wasn't just the isolation or the extreme conditions. It was something deeper, something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Maya's voice, once steady and strong, had become unrecognizable. She had stopped speaking in coherent sentences, instead murmuring to herself in a low, guttural tone, her eyes unfocused. It was clear to the others that she had completely lost touch with reality. Her descent into madness was a reflection of their own unraveling minds. The mountain had found its way inside each of them, breaking them down piece by piece, until they were no longer just survivors on a dangerous expedition. They were victims, ensnared by something far more sinister than they could have ever anticipated. Thomas had seen it before, groups of people slowly driven mad by the pressure of isolation, by the harshness of the environment. But this was different. This wasn't just the mountain's unforgiving conditions. This was something that had purpose. It was deliberate. It wanted them to break. It wanted to claim them. And in the distance, something moved, something more than just the fog. A shadow, dark and formless, that seemed to shift and writhe, a silhouette against the blinding white. The others couldn't see it, but Thomas could. And he knew, deep in his gut, that whatever it was, it had been watching them from the beginning. It had always been there, waiting. As the team continued their descent down the slopes of Mount Everest, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on them even further. The fog, thick as ever, had transformed the once mighty peak into a shadow of itself, a vague, indistinct entity that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. They were no longer climbing a mountain. They were lost in a world that defied reason and comprehension. And yet, each of them was bound to the same grim reality. The mountain was not only alive in some sense, it was alive in a way that transcended their understanding of life itself. The whispers, which had started as a subtle presence in the back of their minds, had now become a constant companion. They weren't just echoes of a distant wind or the trick of an overheated mind. They were intelligible, filled with urgency and intent. At times, it seemed as if the very ground they were walking on was trying to speak to them, each crack of the rock or gust of wind carrying with it a message they were too afraid to decipher. The words were never clear, but they felt undeniably real, pressing in on their psyches as if the mountain was trying to control their very thoughts. Maya's condition had worsened. Once the team's most dependable member, she had now become almost entirely unrecognizable. She was speaking in a constant stream of disconnected words, her body moving in jerky, erratic motions, as though she were no longer in control of her own actions. Her eyes, once sharp and focused, were now vacant, devoid of the life that had made her a competent climber. She wandered aimlessly, often muttering to herself or giggling in a way that felt both unsettling and tragic. Every so often, she would stop and stare into the fog, her gaze fixed on something the others could not see. At times, it seemed as though she were speaking directly to the mountain itself, pleading with it in soft, desperate tones. Jordan had begun to show signs of the same descent. He was jittery, twitching under the weight of a growing paranoia. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the dense fog sent him into a frenzy. It wasn't just the fear of the mountain. It was something more, something primal. His eyes darted around constantly, scanning the invisible horizon, as if he feared an unseen force was creeping ever closer. The whispers in his ears had begun to merge with his own thoughts, as if they were no longer separate entities, but an inseparable part of his consciousness. The lines between what was real and what was imagined had become so blurred that he no longer trusted his senses. He could feel the presence watching him, always just out of reach, yet constantly there, like an oppressive weight on his chest. Thomas, too, was fighting a battle within himself. He could still hear the whispers, but they were becoming harder to ignore. His own thoughts were fractured, piecing together into disjointed fragments. At times, it felt as though the mountain itself were asking him questions, probing his deepest fears and desires. The whispers had started to offer him strange, tantalizing promises. They spoke of salvation, of escape from the madness that had begun to seep into their minds. But the more he listened, the more he realized that these promises came at a cost, one that he wasn't willing to pay. Yet, the whispers continued, urging him forward, telling him that they had the answers, that they knew the way out. It was during one of these moments of disquiet that the team noticed something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up in terror. Out of the corner of his eye, Thomas had caught a flicker of movement in the fog. It was brief, just a shadow passing across the dense mist, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. He wasn't the only one who had seen it. Jordan, Maya, and the others had all frozen at the same moment, their eyes wide with dread as they turned to look toward the source of the movement. But there was nothing there. The fog remained thick and impenetrable, stretching on endlessly in every direction. The uncertainty gnawed at them. The shadow they had glimpsed, that fleeting form, had not felt like a trick of the mind. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. It was not simply the distortion of their perception in the fog. It was something real, something alive, something that was watching them, perhaps even waiting for them. And as the fog closed in tighter around them, it felt as though the presence was growing stronger. They weren't just being followed, they were being stalked. In a rare moment of clarity, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine, and he turned to face the others. "We need to stop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going like this. Whatever is out there, it's not just a mountain. Something is following us, and it knows we're here." But even as he spoke, the words seemed hollow. Deep down, he knew it wasn't just the mountain they needed to worry about. It was the thing that had been lurking in the fog, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had been walking into its trap, and now there was no turning back. Maya, whose eyes had been unfocused and distant, suddenly locked onto him. Her gaze was sharp, unnerving in its intensity. "It's too late," she said in a voice that was no longer her own. "You shouldn't have come here. You're already part of it now. The mountain has chosen. There's no escape." Her words were chilling, each syllable carrying a weight of finality. The others stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. Thomas could feel the shift in the air, a subtle change that filled him with dread. The whispers were growing louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that seemed to rattle his very soul. It was as if the mountain was speaking to them directly now, mocking them for their attempt to conquer it. The fog closed in tighter, and for the first time, Thomas wondered if they had ever really stood a chance. Had they been walking toward the summit, or were they simply walking into the maw of something far darker than they could have imagined? There was no way to know. The answers they sought were slipping further away, and the mountain was becoming something more, a force, an entity, a presence that would not let them leave. And with every step, they were sinking deeper into its grasp. The fog had swallowed them whole, and now, for the first time, the team found themselves unable to discern whether they were moving forward or backward. The same swirling mist surrounded them in every direction, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that did not exist. Time itself had become malleable, slipping away from them, as if the mountain were erasing the boundaries of reality. The further they walked, the more disoriented they became. It was no longer clear if they were on the physical Everest at all, or if they had somehow crossed over into a space where the laws of nature no longer applied. Despite the overwhelming fear that hung over them like a suffocating blanket, the team still pressed forward. But something had shifted between them, a fragile understanding that they were no longer just climbers facing an impossible peak. They were something else now, participants in an unfolding drama where the rules were written by the mountain itself. And yet, despite the growing sense of dread, they all understood that they had no choice but to keep moving. To stop was to surrender, and that in itself was too terrifying to contemplate. Maya's condition continued to deteriorate, but it was no longer just a matter of mental instability. Her body, too, seemed to be changing. She had begun to twitch involuntarily, her fingers curling into strange positions, as if her joints were locking into unnatural angles. It was as though the mountain itself was working its way under her skin, molding her into something else, something inhuman. Her eyes had become glassy, reflecting the fog around her like mirrors, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer that of the Maya they had once known. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had always been here. "She's not herself anymore," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely a whisper as he watched Maya stumble forward, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Jordan, who had been on edge since the very beginning, barely glanced up. His eyes were wild, his face pale and drawn. The whispers in his head had grown louder, the words disorienting and incoherent, yet still undeniable. He had become a shell of himself, his face gaunt, his body twitching in response to the overwhelming tension that had taken root deep in his chest. The fog, which had once been a nuisance, now felt like it was closing in on him personally, suffocating him with every breath he took. "We have to keep going," Jordan said, his voice tight with a panic that had been growing steadily. "We can't stay here. It will..." But before he could finish, a sudden noise cut through the fog. It was faint at first, almost like a distant echo of someone crying. The sound was low, mournful, and unlike anything they had heard before. It reverberated through the dense mist, reaching into their minds and twisting something deep within them. It felt like the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the mountain itself were calling to them, trying to draw them deeper into its grasp. "Did you hear that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. He had stopped walking and was looking around in a panic. The others were silent, listening. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was a human cry, but it was distorted, as though the person crying was in pain, or perhaps calling for help. The distress in the cry felt real, and yet, as they stood there, frozen in place, none of them could decide whether the cry was coming from another person or from the mountain itself. "I don't know if we should follow it," Maya murmured, though her voice wasn't quite her own. "It wants us to..." At those words, a chill spread through the group, and the whispers in the fog seemed to swell, louder now, calling them toward whatever lay beyond the mist. It was impossible to tell if this was a trick of the mind, some hallucination caused by the altitude or the cold, but the sense of urgency was undeniable. There was something pulling them forward, a presence that made them want to run. And yet, the same presence kept them tethered to the fog, unwilling to move unless it gave them permission. The mountain had taken root in their minds, and they were too far gone to escape its influence. "We can't give in," Jordan said, but there was no conviction in his voice. The fog seemed to be playing with him, making him doubt his every thought. He felt the mountain in his bones, and it was urging him to follow, to listen to the cries, to go toward the source. The line between survival and madness had blurred, and they were all caught in the crossfire. The cry came again, louder this time, but there was something different about it. It wasn't just a cry of pain. It was a scream, sharp and desperate, as if someone was being torn apart by invisible hands. The sound sliced through the fog with a ferocity that sent shivers down their spines. And just as suddenly as it had started, the cry stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than the scream had been. It was as if the mountain itself had swallowed the sound whole, leaving nothing but the hollow emptiness of the fog. In that moment, something within Thomas snapped. He felt the pull of the mountain, the weight of its presence pressing against his chest, and he found himself unable to resist it any longer. He stepped forward, each step heavy with the inevitability of what was to come. The others hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but Maya, who had stopped moving entirely, now looked at him with a twisted smile, her eyes wide and unblinking. "You're going to regret this," she said in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the mountain itself. "But it's too late now. You belong to it." The fog seemed to close in tighter, and the team found themselves standing on the precipice of something far darker than they had ever anticipated. They had entered the domain of the mountain, and there was no returning. Whatever had been waiting for them, whatever had been calling to them, was now here, and it would not let them leave. As the fog thickened and the mountain loomed around them like an insurmountable presence, the line between reality and madness began to blur. They had all heard the cry, but now, in the oppressive silence that followed, it was clear that something far worse than physical fatigue was gnawing at them. The mountain wasn't merely a place of danger. It had become a force of will, bending their perception and manipulating their very senses. The cold air felt heavier, the weight of it pressing in from all sides, but it wasn't just the freezing temperatures. It was something deeper, an invisible pressure that permeated their thoughts. Jordan stood frozen, staring into the thick, impenetrable mist. He had heard Maya's words, "You belong to it," and the weight of those words settled heavily on his shoulders. It was no longer a question of surviving the climb. It was a question of what they were becoming. He had long suspected that something was wrong, but now, standing there in the fog with the others, it was clear. The mountain wasn't simply a challenge of physical endurance. It was a test of something much deeper, a test of their minds and souls. And in that moment, Jordan wasn't sure who, if anyone, was still in control. The strange occurrences had been building for days now. It wasn't just the disorienting cries they had heard in the mist or the strange shifts in their surroundings. It was the subtle changes in each of them. Maya, once their most grounded member, was becoming increasingly distant, her words less coherent, her movements jerky. Thomas had begun to show signs of paranoia, his eyes darting around as if he were seeing things that weren't there. And then there was Jordan, who felt his mind slipping, the whispers growing louder, tugging at his thoughts with an intensity he could no longer ignore. "We need to stop," Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice was trembling, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "This isn't just a mountain. It's something else. Something is pulling us in." Maya's response came too quickly, and it unsettled him further. "It's too late for that. We're already part of it. The mountain sees us. It knows us." Thomas recoiled, unsure whether Maya was speaking in riddles or revealing a truth too dark to comprehend. But what unsettled him most was that there was an undeniable certainty in her voice, as if she had known something they hadn't. Her words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like acceptance. She had already given in to whatever the mountain was, and now, She was merely waiting for the others to do the same. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Every breath felt like it was filling their lungs with the weight of ancient secrets, with the knowledge of things they were never meant to understand. It wasn't just the altitude that made their heads swim. It was the atmosphere itself, as if the very air they were breathing was infected with the mountain's will. They were no longer simply climbing a physical peak. They were climbing towards something far older, something that had been waiting for them long before they had ever set foot on the mountain. "Where are we even going?" Jordan asked, his voice trembling. "What's the point of this anymore?" Maya turned to him with a strange, unblinking stare. Her eyes were wide, glassy, as though they were no longer seeing him, but something far beyond him. "The point is to stop running," she whispered. "To stop fighting. We're already here, whether we like it or not." The words echoed in Jordan's mind, each syllable like a nail being driven into his skull. They were no longer just adventurers, no longer people with lives outside of this place. They had crossed a threshold, and now they were as much a part of the mountain as the rock and ice that surrounded them. Thomas, unable to bear the silence any longer, started walking, his feet moving automatically, as though the fog was pulling him forward, guiding him towards something he could not see. It was as though his body was no longer under his control, and yet he couldn't stop. The pressure in his chest mounted with every step, and with each breath, it felt like the mountain was drawing him deeper into its grasp. He wanted to scream, to stop, but his legs moved of their own accord. It wasn't until he saw Maya moving beside him, her movements jerky and unnatural, that he realized he wasn't the only one. They were all being led in a direction none of them could comprehend. "Where are we going?" he demanded, his voice strained. But no one answered. The others, too, were walking now, as though in a trance, their gazes fixed ahead, lost to the fog. The fog was thickening, growing even denser, until Thomas could barely see a few feet in front of him. The mist seemed to shift like it was alive, wrapping around them and pulling them closer together. And as the fog thickened, the shadows grew darker, obscuring their path. It wasn't just the fog anymore. It was as if the very mountain was alive, breathing with them, moving with them. A sudden gust of wind sent a sharp chill through Thomas, snapping him out of his trance-like state. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. Something had changed. There was a faint shape ahead of them, emerging from the fog. It was tall, humanoid, but misshapen, its features hidden by the swirling mist. It wasn't just a figure. It was a presence, something ancient and undeniable. It didn't belong on the mountain, and yet it was there, waiting for them. The air seemed to vibrate with an unspoken command. The others didn't stop, didn't even acknowledge the figure. They continued walking as if they were being drawn toward it. As Thomas stood frozen, he felt the weight of its gaze upon him, like a silent judgment. His breath caught in his throat, but no sound escaped. He knew, deep down, that the figure wasn't just a manifestation of his fear. It was real. And it was waiting. This was no longer a climb. It was something else entirely. The mountain had claimed them, and now they were its unwilling guests, bound to a fate they could not escape. The veil of truth had been lifted, and in that moment, they saw what they had been blind to all along. There was no way back. There never had been. The silence was deafening. Every step they took seemed to echo in the thick, swirling mist that surrounded them, though their surroundings appeared unnaturally still. It was as though the mountain itself had become a living thing, holding its breath in anticipation of something monumental. The figure that had appeared in the fog remained just out of reach, its features still concealed by the shifting clouds of mist, but the weight of its presence hung heavily in the air. It wasn't a physical threat, not in the way they had prepared for during their training, but something far more insidious. This was a challenge of the mind, an invitation to confront the darkness within. Jordan could feel his pulse quickening. He tried to focus on his breathing, but the air was so thin that each inhalation felt labored. It wasn't just the lack of oxygen that was suffocating him. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of dread, like the very mountain was pressing in on them, smothering them with its ancient malice. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. The longer they stayed on this path, the harder it would be to leave. Maya had said it though. We're already part of it. The words had been a whisper, but they felt like a prophecy. Jordan had initially dismissed them as the ramblings of someone overwhelmed by the pressure of the climb. But now, standing in this oppressive silence, he understood. The mountain was not merely a physical obstacle to overcome. It was a force, a presence that seeped into their thoughts and twisted them, altering their perception of reality. They weren't just climbing to the summit anymore. They were being consumed by the mountain itself. Thomas had stopped walking several moments ago. His eyes were wide, fixed on something in the distance, but it wasn't clear what. His breath came in sharp gasps, like he was struggling to find air in the suffocating fog. His hands trembled at his sides, and his legs wavered beneath him. Jordan could see the strain in his face, the panic that was beginning to set in. It was as if Thomas could sense the gravity of the situation, something that Jordan himself could no longer ignore. They had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed. "Thomas, are you all right?" Jordan asked, his voice faltering. But Thomas didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear him. His gaze remained fixed, unfocused, as if he were seeing something that the others couldn't. It was a look that Jordan recognized all too well. The vacant stare of someone who had lost themselves in a vision, or worse, had fallen victim to the madness that this place seemed to breed. Maya, however, didn't seem concerned by Thomas's condition. She simply nodded slowly, her eyes distant, as though she were lost in her own thoughts. "He'll be fine," she said softly, almost soothingly. But her words carried an eerie finality, as if she knew something they didn't. She took a step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had already accepted whatever was coming next. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "He'll be fine?" The words hung in the air, but they didn't feel reassuring. Maya had changed. There was no denying it. The confident, competent leader they had started the climb with had vanished. In her place was someone or something else. Someone who had already surrendered to the mountain's influence, who had already accepted the inevitability of their fate. It made Jordan's skin crawl to think that he was in the presence of someone who had embraced the darkness. He tried to shake the thought from his mind, but it clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. What was happening to them? Were they all doomed to succumb to whatever grip the mountain had on them? Or was there still a chance, however slim, to break free? He had to find an answer, but the more he thought, the more it seemed like the mountain was actively working to prevent him from finding one. It wasn't long before the landscape itself seemed to shift. The rocks beneath their feet, once solid and familiar, seemed to grow more uneven, more treacherous. The path that had seemed so clear before had vanished into a labyrinth of jagged edges and crumbling cliffs. It was as if the mountain was alive, rearranging itself to trap them in an ever-tightening spiral, leading them deeper into its heart. Jordan reached out to steady himself against a rock, but his hand met cold, wet stone, too cold. He recoiled, heart pounding, his mind racing with panic. The air was growing even colder, but it wasn't just the temperature. It felt as though the mountain itself had dipped below freezing, as though it was exhaling a cold, damp breath directly into his bones. "Where are we?" Jordan gasped, his voice sharp in the stillness. His question seemed to hang in the air for a moment before it was swallowed by the fog. No one responded. No one moved. In the eerie quiet, the whispers began again, but this time, they weren't just in his head. They were coming from the fog, from the walls of rock surrounding them. Soft, insistent murmurs that grew louder and louder with each passing second, until they reached a crescendo that made Jordan's teeth rattle in his skull. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The voices, low and guttural, felt like they were coming from inside his mind, scratching and clawing their way to the surface. "They're here," Maya said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, too calm, considering the chaos that was unfolding. "The ones who came before us. The ones who couldn't leave." Thomas looked up then, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "What are you talking about?" He rasped, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "What are you?" But Maya's expression was distant. "They're always here," she muttered, her lips barely moving. And they never leave. Jordan's heart sank into his chest. He could see the fear in Thomas's eyes. And for the first time since the climb began, Jordan felt the chilling certainty that they weren't alone. The mountain had not simply swallowed them up. It had become a prison, and they were its unwilling inmates. The whispers continued, louder now, swirling around them, closing in like a noose. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath them was pulling them deeper into the abyss. They were trapped, and the mountain was the jailer. As the oppressive fog continued to thicken, the group found themselves caught between fear and confusion, unsure of what lay ahead. The whispers seemed to grow louder, their syllables indistinguishable, but laced with a sinister tone, like the echoes of long-forgotten souls desperately trying to make contact. Jordan could feel his pulse racing, but even more than the cold, the terror gripped him. He realized now, more than ever, that the mountain was not simply a physical challenge. It had become an entity unto itself, one that distorted reality, preyed on minds, and fed off the fear of those who dared to climb its unforgiving slopes. Maya's face had taken on a curious expression as she looked up at the sheer rock wall ahead of them. It was unlike anything Jordan had ever seen from her before. Gone was the confident, self-assured leader. Now, she was transfixed, as though something had called her to this very spot, something only she could see. Her eyes widened as she stepped forward, and Jordan caught the faintest tremor in her hands. "This place is alive," Maya whispered, though her voice lacked the usual conviction. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "It's been waiting for us." Jordan frowned, taking a step back as though trying to distance himself from the eerie certainty in her tone. Waiting for us? The idea was almost too surreal to consider. And yet, as he looked around, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something fundamental. It wasn't just the oppressive cold or the disorienting fog. There was a presence here, something that had been waiting in the wings, watching their every move. The air grew colder still as the mountains seemed to draw the heat from their bodies. It wasn't natural, this frigid bite. It was as though the very core of the earth had grown distant, leaving only a barren, frozen wasteland in its wake. Jordan could hear his breath catch in his throat as he fought to keep calm. He glanced over at Thomas, whose skin had gone an ashen gray, his eyes wide and unblinking, yet seeing nothing. There was a vacancy in his gaze, a hollow emptiness that terrified Jordan more than the creeping cold. Whatever had been happening to Maya was now starting to claim Thomas as well. Maya moved towards the rock face, slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the jagged stone, and Jordan felt a strange vibration run through the ground beneath them. It wasn't the normal tremor of the mountain, nor the rumble of wind against the cliffside. It was something more primal, a feeling that seeped deep into the earth and threw it into their bones. Suddenly, the rock wall began to shift. It was so subtle at first that Jordan almost doubted his eyes. But as he stared, the stone seemed to undulate, as though alive, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Then, with a low groan, the stone split, revealing a dark void beyond, a hollow that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The mountain had revealed a hidden path, one that neither Jordan nor the others had seen before. But this was no ordinary passage. It felt like a wound, an opening in the fabric of the world itself. "Look," Maya breathed, her voice almost a chant now. "It's the way." Jordan stepped back, his chest tightening as a sharp instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave. But Maya didn't hesitate. She stepped into the opening without a second thought, her silhouette swallowed by the darkness. Thomas, too, moved toward the void, but his steps were slower, more reluctant, as though he were walking through a nightmare he couldn't escape. "Wait!" Jordan called, reaching out to stop them, but his voice was drowned out by the silence that hung heavy around them. He glanced behind him, half expecting to see something following them, something from the mountain's depths. But the mist, the fog, and the oppressive weight of the atmosphere were the only things present, pressing in on him from all sides. He wasn't sure why he followed. Maybe it was out of a sense of duty, or perhaps out of the fear that if he didn't, he would be left behind, left alone on a mountain that seemed intent on devouring them all. But whatever his reasoning, Jordan found himself stepping into the darkness after them, his heart pounding in his chest. The air inside the passage was thick, suffocating, yet it wasn't cold. In fact, it was unnaturally warm, almost as if they had entered a different world entirely. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made Jordan's skin prickle. The further they walked, the more disoriented he became. The passage twisted and turned in impossible directions, growing narrower and more claustrophobic with every step. The darkness pressed in, swallowing them whole, until the faintest light began to shimmer in the distance. It was then that Jordan began to see them. Faces. They were faint at first, little more than shadows hovering on the edges of his vision. But as they moved closer to the light, the faces became clearer, horrific visages twisted in agony and despair. There were dozens of them, maybe more, each one staring at them with hollow, empty eyes. Some had mouths open in silent screams, while others were frozen in expressions of terror. Jordan froze in place, his heart hammering in his chest, his stomach twisting with dread. "Maya! Thomas! What is this?" he whispered, but his voice faltered. He couldn't look away. The faces were everywhere now, their features blurred but their eyes piercing, as if they were judging them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Maya's voice came from the darkness ahead, soft and eerie. "This is where they go. This is where all the lost souls are trapped. The mountain doesn't let them leave. It takes them, and then they become part of it, part of the mountain's curse." Jordan could feel the weight of her words settling into his mind. He had thought they were climbing towards something, that the summit held the key to whatever madness had taken root in the group. But now, he wasn't so sure. They weren't on a journey to the top of the world. They were descending into something far more terrifying. They had crossed the threshold into a realm where the mountain's true nature was revealed, where it took, consumed, and ultimately replaced. For the first time since this climb began, Jordan wondered if they could ever escape the mountain at all, or if they were already too far gone to ever make it out. The stifling air seemed to thicken as they ventured deeper into the cavernous passage, their footsteps muffled against the eerie stillness that surrounded them. The faces, those haunting visages that floated just out of reach in the shadows, seemed to follow them with every movement. Their hollow eyes, empty but full of an unfathomable despair, flickered in the dim light like broken reflections on a shattered mirror. Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The very mountains seemed alive, a sentient being feeding off their fear. As they walked deeper into the maw of the mountain, the oppressive silence became almost unbearable. There were no sounds of wind, no echo of their footsteps, just the relentless, suffocating pressure of the place closing in around them. Jordan glanced over at Maya, who was leading the way with a strange, almost trance-like determination in her step. Her eyes were fixed on something ahead, something Jordan couldn't see, but felt the pull of nonetheless. He couldn't tell if it was the mountain drawing her in, or if something inside of her had simply given up, surrendering to the darkness. "Where are we going?" Jordan finally asked, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. Maya didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her words were slow, deliberate, as though she had to force them out. "The gatekeeper," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself, rather than to him. "It's what keeps the mountain from swallowing everything completely. It's the balance, the last line between us and everything else." Jordan frowned, his mind racing to keep up with the terrifying implications of her words. The mountain had a keeper, a guardian that stood between them, and whatever twisted force had been manipulating them all since they arrived? Or was it something darker, something that had long since stopped serving its original purpose? "What are you talking about?" Thomas's voice broke through the tension, shaky and filled with a sense of desperation. "What is the gatekeeper? Who is it?" But Maya didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, and for the first time, Jordan noticed that the passage had begun to widen, the walls giving way to a larger, almost cathedral-like space. The air grew warmer still, thick with an unnatural humidity that clung to their skin. The faces were gone now, or perhaps they had simply faded into the very walls themselves. Either way, Jordan's unease was growing by the second. He had no idea what kind of place they were entering, but something inside him told him that once they crossed the threshold of this new space, there would be no going back. When they stepped into the center of the vast chamber, Jordan's heart nearly stopped in his chest. There, standing in the middle of the space, was a figure. At first, it was just a shape, a silhouette against the dark backdrop. But as they drew closer, the details became clearer. The figure was tall, clad in a dark robe that seemed to shift with the shadows themselves, its features obscured by a hood. The only thing Jordan could make out clearly was its eyes. Empty, like the others, but cold and filled with an ancient malice. Maya stopped in front of the figure, as though she had been expecting it all along. She kneeled before it without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the floor, and a strange reverence in her posture. "The gatekeeper," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jordan, however, couldn't bring himself to kneel. He could feel his body rejecting the idea of bowing before something so wrong. He had never believed in gods or spirits, but here, in the shadow of the mountain, in the presence of this thing, it was hard to deny that there was something beyond his understanding, something that had been waiting for them. "What do you want from us?" Thomas asked, his voice cracking with fear as he stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the pocket where he kept the small knife he had brought with him. Jordan watched him, but before he could stop him, Maya turned her head sharply, her eyes flashing with a moment of something darker, something unrecognizable. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and in the next instant, the room seemed to tremble. A low, guttural sound echoed from deep within the mountain, vibrating through the very bones of the earth. It was as though the mountain itself had answered. The gatekeeper's voice came then, deep and resonant, echoing through the chamber. It was both a whisper and a roar, a sound that reverberated in their chests. "Not what you think," it intoned, its voice cold as ice. "You are not the ones who seek me. You have come to understand what was never meant for you to know. You are trespassers in the realm of the forgotten." Jordan took a step back, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what was happening, but every instinct he had told him to run. This wasn't a place for humans. This was something else. Maya's kneeling posture seemed to shift slightly, almost as if she were communing with the gatekeeper, listening, receiving. The figure turned its hollow eyes toward Jordan then, as if it had just noticed him for the first time. "You are the one who resists, the one who has not embraced the mountain's gift. But you will. You all will." Jordan's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he swore he saw the edges of the gatekeeper's form shimmer, distort, as if the figure were more than it seemed. The air in the chamber grew heavier, pressing down on him from all sides. The weight of it was unbearable, suffocating. His legs felt like lead, but his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. He was losing control, losing his grip on reality itself. "Maya," he choked out, but she didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she continued to kneel before the gatekeeper, her hands raised, fingers trembling as if she were reaching for something far beyond her. Jordan didn't know if she was reaching for salvation or damnation. But in that moment, he realized that whatever the gatekeeper was, whatever power it held, Maya had already accepted it. Thomas looked between them, his face pale and drawn tight with fear. But before he could make a move, the gatekeeper's voice boomed again, louder this time, filling the chamber with an overwhelming force. "You will remain," it declared, its eyes locking on Jordan's with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. "And when you do, you will become part of the mountain. All of you." In that instant, Jordan understood. They were not meant to leave. They had never been meant to leave. The mountain didn't let its visitors go. It absorbed them, turned them into part of its twisted, forgotten realm. And in that moment, Jordan knew that the mountain had already claimed them. The question was no longer whether they could escape. It was whether they could resist being transformed by it. The tension in the cavern was palpable. The gatekeeper's proclamation hung in the air like a dense fog, choking the very breath from their lungs. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with a rhythm not of their own making, a constant reminder that the mountain was alive, alive with a hunger that could never be sated. Jordan's eyes flicked back to Maya, who remained unmoved, her gaze locked with the gatekeeper in a silent communion that sent chills racing down his spine. It was as if she had already crossed over, already become part of this unholy union. The realization hit Jordan like a slap to the face. Maya was no longer the person he had known. Whatever this mountain had done to her, it had changed her body and soul. His pulse quickened as he glanced over at Thomas. The fear on his face was unmistakable, wide eyes, tense posture. But there was something else there too. Something Jordan couldn't place. A certain acceptance, perhaps, or maybe even relief. As if Thomas had come to terms with the reality of their situation. Or worse, as though he had already begun to believe the mountain's lies. "Maya," Jordan whispered again, but his voice seemed distant, almost drowned out by the weight of the cavern. She didn't even flinch. He moved towards her, a step, then another, but each movement seemed to take longer, as if the very air was growing heavier with each passing second. The gatekeeper's gaze never left him. It felt like a pressure, cold and unyielding, creeping under his skin, tightening around his chest. "Don't approach her." The gatekeeper's voice suddenly filled the space again, and Jordan froze mid-step. The tone was different now, calmer, more patient, as though it were speaking to a child who had yet to understand the rules of the game. "She has made her choice. You, however, still hesitate. Why?" Jordan's mouth was dry, his thoughts scattered. He wanted to scream, to demand what this creature was, why it had chosen them, why Maya had surrendered so easily to it. But no words came. His mind spun in a whirl of confusion, anger, and fear. What choice did they have, after all? The mountain had ensnared them from the moment they set foot on its cursed slopes. There was no running now, no escaping. This place, this living, breathing, monstrous entity, had plans for them all, and it wasn't going to let them go without taking its toll. "You think you can walk away unscathed?" The gatekeeper's voice echoed again, this time colder, sharper. "Knowledge comes with a price, Jordan, and you have crossed the threshold. There is no going back." The words hit Jordan with a clarity that stopped him dead in his tracks. He had thought, hoped, that he could somehow turn back, that he could find a way to escape the mountain's grasp. But the gatekeeper was right. They had crossed into something far beyond their understanding, a place where mere mortals were never meant to tread. The knowledge they sought had already claimed them. The mountain's secrets, its darkness, were now a part of them, as much a part of their bodies as the blood that pulsed through their veins. "Why did you bring us here?" Thomas asked suddenly, his voice trembling but louder now, as if defying the silence that had swallowed them whole. His question seemed to hang in the air like a fragile thread, but it was enough to break through the suffocating tension that gripped them all. The gatekeeper's eyes flickered, the faintest glint of amusement in its gaze. "I did not bring you here," it said slowly, as though explaining something simple to an ignorant child. "You came of your own will. You sought answers. I am the answer. I am the truth. And the truth, as you will come to understand, is that the mountain does not offer mercy. It only offers revelation." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. He had known, deep down, that the mountain had its own purpose, its own will. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the gatekeeper lay it out so plainly, made the reality of their situation even more terrifying. The mountain was not some random force of nature. It was sentient, and it had been watching them, studying them, long before they ever set foot on its slopes. It had known they would come, and it had chosen them. Thomas took a shaky breath. Revelation? What kind of revelation? The gatekeeper's laugh was a low, rumbling sound, as if the very rocks beneath them were mocking their ignorance. Revelation of the self. You will see who you truly are, stripped of your delusions. You will know what you are capable of when pushed to the limits. And when you reach that limit, you will either break or you will rise. But you will know. Jordan's thoughts were racing now. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed, where the true nature of their ordeal revealed itself. But there was a part of him, a part that had been buried deep down, that wondered what would happen if they gave in. What would it feel like to surrender to the mountain's will, to accept its truth, and let go of everything they had once held dear? Could they even escape it now? The answer came before he could fully process the question. The air in the cavern began to shift again, the temperature dropping rapidly. Jordan's breath came out in fogged bursts, and his skin prickled with a sudden chill. Maya's head jerked up then, her eyes meeting his with a sudden intensity that sent a ripple of unease through him. It was as though she had awoken from a deep sleep, but her expression was not the same. It was colder, more distant. "It is time," the gatekeeper intoned, its voice vibrating through their bones. The test has begun. The air thickened around them, and Jordan felt his body grow heavy, his limbs unresponsive. Something was happening, something irreversible. And no matter how much he fought it, no matter how desperately he tried to resist, he could feel the mountain's presence creeping into his mind, its cold fingers wrapping around his consciousness. It wasn't just the mountain that was changing. It was him. Suddenly, the cavern seemed to crack open, an explosion of light filling the space. Jordan's body jerked violently, his vision going white as the force slammed into him. His last coherent thought before everything went black was simple. This was only the beginning. The world around Jordan was pitch black. The coldness that had gripped the cavern had now seeped into his very soul, draining all warmth from his body. His senses felt dulled, as if a thick fog had clouded every corner of his mind. For a moment, he wondered if this was death, if he had crossed some invisible line that separated the living from the dead. But no, something told him he wasn't dead, not yet. There was still a pulse beneath his skin, still a faint breath escaping his lips. And yet, the silence that enveloped him was all-consuming. He could not hear his own breath, nor could he feel his heartbeat. It was as though he had been swallowed by the mountain itself, consumed by its ancient hunger. Time lost all meaning. It could have been seconds or hours, or even days. Jordan could not tell. But as the darkness stretched on, the sense of isolation became unbearable. His thoughts were like distant echoes, bouncing against the walls of his mind, but never finding clarity. It was then that he began to feel something, a sensation far too subtle to place at first. It was not physical, not at all, but something deeper, something that pierced through the fog of his mind like a needle through fabric. It was a presence. He could feel it pressing in on him from all sides. Not a physical presence, not a sound or a touch, but something much older, much more ancient. The mountain itself was aware of him, aware of all of them. It was watching, waiting, and somehow Jordan knew this was the moment when it would reveal its true nature. Then, the light exploded again, bright and blinding. Jordan flinched, instinctively raising his hands to shield his eyes, though the light didn't seem to burn or hurt. It simply was washing over him in a flood. The cavern, the dark expanse that had consumed him, was gone. In its place was something far worse, a vast, hollow expanse stretching out endlessly. He was standing on a plateau of sheer stone, surrounded by an abyss that seemed to go on forever. And there, standing across from him, was Maya. But she was not the Maya he remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, her posture stiff, as though she were no longer fully aware of her own body. She looked like a puppet, strings pulled taut by some unseen force. A force that was not entirely her own. "Maya!" Jordan called out, though his voice sounded muffled in the expanse. It didn't feel real, not anymore. Nothing did. Maya's head jerked toward him. Her expression shifted, but it wasn't the same warmth he had once known. There was something colder about her now, something that seemed other. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were not hers. They came from somewhere deeper, from somewhere Jordan couldn't place. "The truth is not what you think," the voice rasped. Far too old, far too cold to be Maya's own. Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. The voice, the thing that spoke through her, was not human. It was something else entirely. And for the first time since their journey began, Jordan felt the full weight of their predicament. This was not just a mountain. It was a being, a creature older than time, with a mind and will of its own. And it was pulling the strings, controlling them all. They were merely pawns in its game. "What do you mean?" Jordan asked, his voice trembling, unsure whether he was speaking to Maya or the force that had consumed her. The mountain, didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted Maya's head slightly, as though studying him. Its eyes seemed to gleam with an intelligence that was both terrifying and alien. Then, in a voice that made Jordan's heart race, it spoke again. "Those who seek the truth must be willing to pay the price," it intoned, each word weighted with centuries of darkness. "And you, Jordan, have sought more than most. You have come to understand, but you do not yet know the cost." The air around him thickened, as if the very space was shrinking, drawing in on itself. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very bones of the mountain. Jordan staggered, trying to keep his footing as the stone cracked and splintered around him. Something was changing, something fundamental about the very fabric of reality itself. "You are not the first to seek answers here," the voice continued, its coldness cutting into Jordan's very soul. "But you are the first to come this close to the truth. And for that, you will face a reckoning." A reckoning? The word echoed in his mind. He tried to move toward Maya, to reach her, but his legs felt like they were bound in chains, heavy and immovable. It was as though the mountain had ensnared him, keeping him in place to witness whatever nightmare it planned to reveal. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open, a fissure tearing through the stone like a wound in the earth itself. A flash of white-hot light shot from the depths, blinding him, searing his vision. His body lurched forward as if pulled by an invisible force. And then, with a gut-wrenching lurch, the world shifted. Jordan was no longer standing on the plateau. He was somewhere else. The world around him was unfamiliar, alien. Dark, twisted shapes moved through the air, impossibly large and grotesque. The sky was a sickly green, and the wind howled like the voice of some ancient creature in torment. His breath caught in his throat, the realization crashing down on him like a weight he could hardly bear. He was no longer on Mount Everest. He had crossed into something else entirely, something beyond space, beyond time. The voice of the mountain boomed in his mind, its presence suffocating. "You have entered the realm of the forgotten, Jordan. Here, there is no escape. Here, you will learn the truth of your existence. But be warned, some truths are too much for the mind to bear." The words hung in the air like a warning, a prophecy that Jordan could not escape. It was as if his fate had already been sealed. The truth, whatever it was now unfolding before him, and he was powerless to stop it. In that moment, Jordan realized that the mountain had never been a mere obstacle. It was a prison, and he had been condemned from the very start. The knowledge he had sought, the truth he had so desperately wanted to uncover, had come at an unfathomable cost. And now, there was no turning back. Jordan's mind was teetering on the edge of something unrecognizable, some boundary between the reality he once knew and this new, nightmarish world. The landscape around him, once so familiar and tangible, had become something alien, something wrong. It was as though the rules that governed existence, gravity, time, space, no longer applied. The very air around him felt thick, oppressive, as though it was filled with the weight of some unspeakable knowledge, pressing in on him from every direction. He had always known that there was something off about Mount Everest. It had never been just a mountain. It had always been more, something beyond the reach of human understanding. But now, as he stood at the precipice of whatever this place had become, Jordan realized how little he had truly understood. This was not just a physical journey. No, this was a journey of the mind, a descent into a place where logic and reason had no power. For a brief moment, Jordan felt the desperate urge to scream, to cry out for help, for someone, anyone, to bring him back to a world he could comprehend. But his throat was dry, his body stiff, and the words that should have come seemed lost, swallowed by the hollow, empty air around him. The mountain had claimed him, body and soul, and in doing so, had erased all sense of time, place, and purpose. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the distorted landscape shifted. The grotesque, twisted shapes in the sky dissolved, leaving nothing but a vast expanse of emptiness. The air felt thinner now, colder, as though the very fabric of existence had thinned, leaving only the raw, unfiltered essence of whatever lay beyond the veil of human perception. Jordan tried to move, but his legs betrayed him, buckling beneath him as if they no longer belonged to his body. He collapsed to the ground, his palms scraping against the rough, alien surface of the land. He could feel the strange energy beneath the surface, a pulse, a rhythm, as though the very ground itself was alive, breathing, and waiting. He shuddered, unsure if the sensation was real or just another fragment of his spiraling mind. The voice, that ancient, unnerving voice, returned, seeping into his thoughts like a poison. You wanted to understand, it whispered, a deep, reverberating hum that seemed to echo in the pit of his stomach. But now you will know that some knowledge is a curse, Jordan. This place is not meant to be understood. It is not meant for you. The words cut through him, a jagged blade scraping against his sanity. He had come here seeking answers, but now, standing on the precipice of something unfathomable, Jordan was beginning to realize that some answers were too dangerous to seek. The truth was no longer something he wanted to understand. It was something that terrified him, something that threatened to swallow him whole. As he fought to push himself back onto his feet, his mind raced. Was there a way out of this place? Was there a way to undo what had been done? Could he escape the grip of the mountain and return to the world he once knew? But as the thoughts swirled in his head, another, more terrifying realization settled into his bones. This place didn't just contain him. It was changing him. The mountain was altering his very nature, warping his understanding of reality, slowly breaking down the walls that separated his mind from the horrors it had uncovered. Jordan's pulse quickened as he looked around, trying to discern any familiar landmark, any sign that could lead him back to the reality he knew. But the landscape was empty, vast, and unforgiving. The air itself felt hostile, as if the mountain itself were actively keeping him from finding his bearings. There were no stars above, no horizon to mark the passing of time. It was as though the world itself had been erased, leaving only him and the emptiness that stretched on forever. Then, through the haze of his confusion and panic, Jordan heard something, an almost imperceptible rustle in the air, a whispering sound that sent a chill through his spine. He strained his ears, trying to make sense of it, and then the words came, clear and sharp, as though they had been waiting for him to hear them. You are not alone here. The voice wasn't the mountains. It was something else, something human. Jordan's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound, desperate for any sign of life, any sign that he wasn't the last one left in this endless void. And there, just beyond the reach of his sight, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was faint at first, a blur against the darkness, but as it drew closer, Jordan could make out the outline of a person, a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by the shadows. The man's eyes glinted with an unsettling gleam as he approached, and Jordan felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity surge within him. What was this person doing here? How had they survived in this place, if indeed they had? Who are you? Jordan managed to croak, his voice sounding foreign in his own ears. How long have you been here? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped just in front of Jordan, his gaze piercing. There was something unsettling about him, something that seemed wrong, as though he too was no longer entirely human. You shouldn't have come, the man finally said, his voice low and hoarse. No one leaves here. No one. Jordan felt a surge of dread course through his veins as the truth began to settle into him. The man before him wasn't a survivor. He was a part of the mountain, a reflection of its power. This place wasn't just a prison. It was a trap designed to ensnare those who ventured too far, those who dared to uncover the secrets buried beneath its surface. And the mountain didn't let go of its prisoners. You think you can escape, the man continued, stepping closer, his breath colder than the air around them. But once you've entered this place, there is no escape. It changes you, it consumes you, and soon, you will become just like the rest of us. Trapped. Forever. Jordan's mind raced, the weight of his situation crashing down on him. The realization was chilling, but it also gave him a sense of clarity. There was no escape. Not from a mountain, not from the truth. Whatever had been unleashed on Mount Everest had long since passed the point of no return. He was part of something far larger, something far darker than he could have ever imagined. And as the man's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pity and malice, Jordan knew, deep in his gut, that the descent into madness had only just begun. The weight of the man's words lingered in the cold, thin air. Trapped. Forever. The concept seemed incomprehensible at first, an absurdity that had no place in the rational world Jordan once knew. And yet, as the mountain's grip seemed to tighten around him, the truth began to settle in with a suffocating certainty. He was no longer simply standing on Mount Everest, battling the forces of nature. He was immersed in something deeper, something far older, that had been lurking beneath the surface long before he or anyone else had dared to climb the peak. The man before him, this figure who spoke with such disturbing calmness, was not what he appeared to be. There was something hollow about his presence, as though he existed more as an echo of humanity than as an actual person. His skin was pale, the color of death, and his eyes glinted with the faintest reflection of the mountain's icy darkness. He was a human in the way Jordan had understood. He was a manifestation of the mountain, a projection of its terrifying power. "You don't understand," the man said, almost pityingly. "The mountain is alive. It sees, it knows, and it wants." Jordan took a step back, recoiling instinctively. This was no longer a mountain as he had once envisioned it. The physical summit of a planet's highest peak, a challenge for the brave, a goal for the determined. It was a living, breathing thing, something that transcended human comprehension. As the man's words settled in, the pieces of Jordan's fractured understanding began to fall into place. This wasn't merely a place of isolation and danger. It was something that consumed, something that shaped the very essence of those who dared to approach it. This was a force of nature that operated outside the laws of time and space, pulling at the boundaries of reality itself. The realization struck Jordan like a physical blow. He had always been drawn to the idea of the unknown, the thrill of exploration and the promise of discovery. He had climbed mountains before, faced harsh conditions and isolation, but there had always been an end to it, a summit to reach, a safe return to normalcy. But now, in the presence of this man, the living echo of the mountain's will, he understood that no one who ventured here would ever return to what they once knew. The mountain had claimed them. Jordan's mind raced. Was this man once like him? Had he, too, been drawn to Everest's towering allure, only to fall victim to its twisted power? The more Jordan thought about it, the more he realized that the man's appearance seemed almost too familiar. It was as though the mountain had reshaped him, remade him in its image, just as it would eventually do to Jordan. "I was just like you," the man said, as if reading Jordan's thoughts. "I thought I could conquer it. I thought I could outsmart it. But the mountain doesn't care about your will. It doesn't care about your strength. It only wants your soul." The words were chilling, but Jordan felt no surprise. He had felt the mountain's presence from the moment he set foot on its slopes, an oppressive, heavy sensation that seemed to weigh on his very soul. He thought it was just the altitude, the isolation, the overwhelming environment that led to this suffocating feeling. But now, standing face to face with this man, he understood. The mountain was feeding on him, feeding on his desperation, his fear, and his desire for answers. "What is it? What does it want?" Jordan asked, his voice hoarse. He wanted to demand more about the mountain, more about this place, but his words felt futile. What could he truly understand now, after everything that had happened? Was there even an answer that would make sense anymore? The man's lips twisted into a smile that was devoid of warmth. "It wants everything," he said softly. "It wants you. It wants your mind, your body, your spirit. And once it has you, it will consume you whole." Jordan's breath hitched, his stomach lurching at the thought of being absorbed into something so vast, so unknowable. The sense of foreboding that had been building for days now clamped down on him with a terrifying finality. He wasn't just a person trapped in a mountain's harsh conditions. He was a sacrifice, an offering to something that had no concept of human existence. The mountain's hunger was endless, and it was coming for him. For a fleeting moment, Jordan considered running. He thought of the supplies he had left, the gear, the equipment. The idea of escape briefly flickered in his mind. But as soon as the thought emerged, it was crushed under the suffocating weight of the landscape around him. There was nowhere to go. The man's presence, the mountain's unyielding grip, was everywhere. It was as if the ground itself had become a part of the mountain, a vast, entropic expanse where movement, time, and effort meant nothing. He was already lost, even if he couldn't fully grasp it yet. The man moved closer, his feet silent on the snow, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You see, Jordan," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the mountain doesn't let go. It doesn't forget, and it's not interested in you as a climber. You're not a conquest. You're an offering. It only takes what it needs, and once it's done, it lets you go, if only to show you that no one truly escapes." A chill crept up Jordan's spine, and he swallowed hard. The man's words seemed to hold a cruel promise, the kind of knowledge that one could never unlearn, no matter how much they wished to. And then, in that moment, Jordan understood. He was part of something far larger, far darker than he had ever imagined. The mountain had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to fall into its grasp, to understand its true nature. And now it had him. He was not just a climber anymore. He was a witness to something that defied every law of the world. There was no summit, no goal, no end. The mountain was its own end, its own beginning, and there was nothing Jordan could do to stop it. The descent was already underway, whether he was ready for it or not. The man's shadow loomed over him now, casting an eerie silhouette against the swirling mist. And soon, he whispered, his voice like the crackling of a fire long gone cold, "You will be just like me, a part of the mountain, forever." Jordan's knees buckled beneath him, and as he collapsed to the ground, the mountain's grip tightened further. There was no escape, only the endless, consuming cold. The days blurred into one another as the cold seemed to deepen and solidify around Jordan. He had become numb to the biting wind, the stinging frost that laced his skin, and the oppressive silence that pressed in from every side. He could no longer discern whether it was the mountain's will that kept him bound in place or the sheer hopelessness of his situation. The air, once a symbol of life at such high altitudes, now felt like a whispering death that wrapped around his lungs, each breath an agonizing effort. Time had become irrelevant. It had slipped away, consumed by the mountain itself. As Jordan stumbled through the shifting snow, the presence of the man, the figure he now understood as the mountain's manifestation, continued to haunt his every step. He was everywhere, in every gust of wind, every cold whisper that rustled through the rocks and ice. Jordan had once thought the man's words were the ramblings of someone broken by the mountain, but now they reverberated in his mind like a haunting refrain. The mountain doesn't let go. It doesn't forget. It was a truth he could no longer escape. The wind howled louder, as if to answer his silent reflection. It was as though the very elements of Everest itself were conspiring against him. In the distance, where the peaks seemed to scrape against the sky, the wind seemed to carry with it voices. Faint and distorted, barely perceptible, but undeniably present. Were they the echoes of others who had come before him? Climbers, explorers, perhaps even those who had once been like the man, now lost to the mountain's insatiable hunger? He couldn't tell anymore, but the sound gnawed at him relentlessly. He tried to focus, to find something solid, something familiar to hold on to in the disorienting chaos of his surroundings. But there was nothing. The mountain had erased all traces of his former life, his past, his identity. All of it had been swept away by the blizzards and the cold, consumed by the very thing he had come to conquer. And now, the voices in the wind seemed to mock him, pushing him further into a spiral of madness. What had he really been seeking? The question was unanswerable, a riddle that no longer mattered. For days now, he had been walking, always walking, towards some unknown destination, some invisible summit that no longer had meaning. Every step seemed to take him further into the void. His thoughts were beginning to fray, his connection to reality slipping as the mountain bent time and space to its will. The world around him had become a shifting blur of snow and rock, the landscape morphing with every glance, and his very body felt foreign to him now. It had been too long since he had seen the faces of his companions, too long since the comfort of camaraderie had warmed his spirit. Jordan's mind, already weary from the endless isolation, turned to thoughts of escape, even if the man had told him there was none. His thoughts moved in frantic circles, desperately seeking a solution that made sense, but everything he considered felt futile. The simple acts of climbing, of moving forward, had become his life's only goal, but even that seemed hopeless. No direction felt right. No summit awaited him. It was as though he was trapped in a labyrinth of his own mind, the path forward no clearer than the fog that surrounded him. In the midst of this disorienting reality, something stirred, a subtle shift in the wind, a change in the air. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as the temperature dropped even further. Was it his imagination, or had the wind suddenly become thicker, heavier? He could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth, the sensation of something wrong settling in his chest. A deep, primal sense of dread rose within him, something ancient and instinctual. This was not the mountain's normal, unyielding cold. This was different. This was something alive. The wind, once a constant force that battered his body, now whispered in his ears, soft and insistent. Leave. Leave now. The voice was faint, but it carried with it the weight of 1,000 warnings, 1,000 lost souls. He couldn't tell whether it was his mind slipping or whether the mountain itself had begun to speak to him. But it wasn't a voice of pity or malice. It was a voice of command. It was as if the mountain itself had decided that his presence was no longer tolerated. With trembling hands, Jordan clutched his jacket, the fabric now stiff with ice. He looked around, hoping to find some trace of human life, some sign of the world he had once known. But there was nothing, only the vast, endless whiteness of the mountain, a canvas that seemed to stretch on infinitely. He was alone, and yet, the mountain had a way of making one feel profoundly, terrifyingly watched. The shadows between the rocks seemed to loom and stretch, shifting unnaturally, as if something large and monstrous were moving just beyond his line of sight. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breathing became shallow as the wind grew colder still. He stumbled, the weight of his exhaustion and despair pressing down on him, pulling him to the ground. His fingers, stiff and numb, scraped at the snow as if trying to grasp at something, anything, to anchor him in this nightmarish world. The wind screamed, the voices growing louder, more insistent. Leave, leave now. But where? Where could he go? The mountain had already taken everything from him. There was no escaping it now. As he lay in the snow, shaking and gasping for breath, he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, barely perceptible against the blinding whiteness. A shape, a figure. The man. He was standing in the distance, motionless, his pale form barely visible through the blizzard. Jordan's heart leaped in his chest, the memories of the man's chilling words coming back with brutal clarity. You will never leave. He felt his stomach churn, his mind reeling with the terrible thought. Could it be that the man had been the mountain's first victim? Was he now its servant, its guide, doomed to walk this frozen wasteland forever? And yet, even as the figure faded from his vision, Jordan knew without a doubt, that he was no longer alone. The mountain had found him. The mountain was watching him, and there was nowhere left to run. The coldness of the wind wrapped tighter around him, the whispers growing louder until they consumed every thought, every hope he had once clung to. He had entered the mountain's grasp, and there would be no leaving. The wind, now eerily quiet, seemed to promise only one thing. The mountain always gets what it wants. The night seemed endless, and Jordan's mind wavered between consciousness and delirium. The once sharp clarity he had felt upon first setting foot on Everest had long since dissipated, replaced by a foggy haze of confusion and fear. His body, weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless cold, felt as though it was no longer his own. He could barely distinguish reality from hallucination. But what terrified him most was the eerie silence that had settled over the mountain. He had not heard the wind for what felt like hours. The deafening roar that had been a constant companion was suddenly absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed unnatural at these heights. The absence of sound left a hollow feeling in his chest, a void that made his mind race with unanswerable questions. Where was the wind? Had it stopped? Had the mountain grown tired of him? Or was this yet another trap it had set to ensnare his thoughts? The snow beneath him had begun to harden, its crystalline surface catching the dim light of his headlamp in odd, angular patterns. He stared at it as though it might hold the key to his escape, but all he could see was the reflection of his own eyes, wide with fear, bloodshot from days of fatigue and exposure. They were the eyes of a man who had lost hope, who had resigned himself to the terrifying fact that he might never leave this place. Yet beneath that fear, there was something else, a nagging sensation that perhaps he was not meant to leave. The wind, once an omnipresent force, had ceased entirely, and in its place, there was a strange, quiet murmur, faint but discernible, as though voices were calling to him from deep within the mountain. He stood up, feeling the pull of those voices as they seeped into his mind. They were not words at first, merely sounds, whispers, echoes, distorted as if they had traveled for miles through ice and stone. Yet they grew clearer with every passing moment, the voices becoming sharper, more distinct. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was hearing. They were not just voices. They were names. Names of people. People who had been here before, climbing the mountain, their hopes and dreams now lost to the unforgiving peaks. The names echoed in his mind like a warning, a litany of those who had perished on Everest slopes. They were not mere climbers. They were the forgotten. The voices seemed to reach out to him from the abyss, trying to pull him in. Jordan, Jordan. The whisper of his own name sent a shiver down his spine. How could they know him? How could they remember him? He had only been here for a short time compared to those who had come before him. Yet it felt as though the mountain itself was drawing a connection between their fates, as though it had already claimed him as one of its own. With every step he took, the voices grew louder, more urgent. He wanted to close his ears to them, to block them out, but the sound seemed to sink deeper into his very bones. His skin prickled, and his vision blurred, as though the mountain was weaving an intricate web around his senses. Was it the cold, or was it something more? The realization came crashing down on him like a wave. This mountain is alive. Jordan staggered forward, his heart racing. The wind had returned, but it was not the wind he remembered. It was something heavier, something more insidious. The snow underfoot felt colder, the air thicker, as if the mountain was breathing around him, its inhospitable embrace tightening. The whispers intensified, now more than just words. They were like shadows that clung to him, weighing him down. His feet grew heavier with each step, as if the very mountain was trying to drag him under. The voices became clearer now, too clear to ignore. They were not just calling his name. They were offering him something, a promise that resonated with a primal part of his psyche. Join us, Jordan. Come to us. We will never leave you. The words felt like a death sentence, yet a part of him wanted to give in, to fall into the cold embrace of the mountain. What was left for him beyond these frozen peaks? What would he be returning to? With trembling hands, Jordan clutched his pack and tried to push forward, his mind a cacophony of fear, confusion, and longing. He had seen the man, the first victim, the one who had warned him, but even that encounter seemed distant now. The warnings had lost their weight. The fear had become something he no longer had the strength to fight. He was starting to see the truth of what the mountain was, a living entity, a monstrous force that fed on the spirits of those who climbed it, trapping them in an endless cycle of loss and suffering. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, but Jordan did not stop. He could feel the mountain's presence like a cold hand gripping his chest, squeezing the life from him, and yet he could not bring himself to give up. The voices whispered again, soft and persuasive, and for the first time, Jordan felt a sickening clarity settle over him. This is what EVEREST does. It doesn't kill you. It takes you, piece by piece, until you are nothing more than a shadow walking in its wake. With the weight of that realization bearing down on him, Jordan's legs finally gave way. He crumpled into the snow, gasping for air, his breath ragged and shallow. The voices were no longer whispers. They were full-fledged cries, a chorus of the mountain's victims, each one demanding recognition, demanding acknowledgement of their existence. They had been here before him, and now they would never leave. And in that moment, Jordan understood. He was already one of them. The mountain had him now, and there was no escaping. As Jordan lay in the snow, gasping for air, the cold gnawed at his consciousness. His limbs trembled from exhaustion, and his mind, once clear enough to understand the depths of his plight, now teetered on the edge of madness. The voices were relentless, filling the space around him, becoming part of the very fabric of the mountain, as if it had woven them into the ice and stone. The weight of their presence bore down on him, heavy and suffocating, drowning him in the icy abyss. The realization that he was no longer a separate entity from the mountain hit him with the force of an avalanche. He was one of the many now, indistinguishable from those who had come before him. Their fates were tangled together. His life, now a thread woven into the tapestry of Everest's cruel history. The promises of the voices, their beckoning whispers, had tricked him into accepting his inevitable fate, and now he was a prisoner to the mountain, locked in its cold, unyielding embrace. But as the fog of despair began to settle over him, Jordan's mind shifted. In that moment of surrender, a peculiar sensation stirred within him. It was subtle at first, like a faint, invisible thread tugging at his awareness. The voices, which had once been sharp and commanding, seemed to dim, their urgency replaced by something altogether different. A strange calm, a lullaby of sorts that echoed in the back of his mind. Had the mountain truly claimed him? Or was it playing another game, wrapping him in a veil of illusions so that he could no longer distinguish reality from the nightmare it had cast around him? His body ached, yes, but there was a flicker of something else, a sense that all was not as it appeared. The weight of the mountain's grasp seemed to lessen, as if the very ground beneath him was shifting, offering a way out. Jordan forced his numb limbs to move, each movement excruciating but necessary. His survival instincts, though clouded by exhaustion and fear, were still alive. He couldn't afford to give in completely, not when the mountain had become so much more than just a place. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that could manipulate and control. But what if it was not invincible? What if, in his surrender, he could find a way to break free, to undo the cruel web it had woven around him? The wind, which had been still for what seemed like an eternity, picked up again, but it was different this time. Instead of the biting, howling gusts that had once dominated the landscape, the wind now seemed to carry a strange, comforting warmth. It wrapped around him like a blanket, almost as though it were trying to coax him into standing up. Was it possible that the mountain, or something within it, had offered him this strange reprieve as a test? Jordan struggled to his feet, his body aching with every movement, but his resolve hardening with each passing second. The voices, the chilling whispers, had not disappeared entirely, but they were quieter now, as if they had been momentarily appeased. Their calls, though faint, still echoed in the distance, a reminder of what awaited those who failed to escape the mountain's grip. But Jordan no longer felt like a victim. He felt like a survivor, a man who still had a chance, a man who refused to let the mountain define him. He scanned his surroundings, the snow-covered terrain stretching out before him. But something was different. The landscape, once an oppressive force, now seemed almost familiar. It was as if the mountain had momentarily revealed its true nature, and Jordan could see beyond the veil of illusions it had cast upon him. He could see paths he had not noticed before, hidden routes that led away from the craggy peaks and toward the distant base camp. The mountain had shown him a way out, a secret that only those who had come to understand its true power could uncover. But the path was not without its dangers. The mountain, though it had revealed its secret, was not done with him yet. It would not relinquish its hold so easily. As Jordan began to move toward the newly discovered path, he felt the mountain stir once again, like a great beast stirring from slumber. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of ancient forces that had watched over this cursed place for centuries. The whispers began again, this time with more force, louder and more insistent than ever. "Come back," they urged. "There is no escape. You belong to us now." Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, his legs shaking, but his resolve growing stronger. The mountain was not going to let him go easily, but he had seen its weakness. He had glimpsed the illusion it had wrapped around him. He knew now that it was not a force of nature. It was something darker, something that thrived on fear, on the belief that it could never be defeated. But Jordan was no longer afraid. He could hear the wind once again, but this time it was no longer a threat. It was a reminder of his own strength, a force that, despite the mountain's best efforts, still roared in his chest. As he stepped forward, Jordan's mind cleared, the fog of fear and illusion lifting as he embraced the knowledge that he could fight back. The mountain had shown him its power, but it had also shown him a way out. It was then that Jordan understood. The real battle was not with the mountain, but with the fear that had gripped him for so long. If he could overcome that, he could overcome anything. With that realization, he took his first step on the path toward freedom, the mountain's whispers growing fainter with every step he took away from it. The journey ahead was far from over, but Jordan had found something far more valuable than survival. He had found hope, and that was something the mountain could never take from him. The path Jordan had found was not a salvation. It was a trap. The whispers, which had once seemed faint and distant, now reverberated within him, louder than ever before. Each step he took away from the towering cliffs seemed to pull him back, as if invisible hands were tugging at his very soul. The warmth of the wind had disappeared entirely, replaced by an unsettling cold that cut through him, deeper than the snow and ice ever could. He could no longer tell whether it was the mountain or his mind playing tricks on him. Had he been deceived once more? As he continued to walk, each step felt like it brought him closer to something, a revelation, perhaps an end. The landscape around him was eerily silent. The usual sounds of the mountain, whispers of snowflakes and creaks of ice, had stilled entirely. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time, Jordan allowed himself to consider the possibility that escape was impossible. That everything, the journey, the discovery of the hidden path, the faint warmth, had been a cruel illusion meant to lure him deeper into the mountain's grasp. He stopped. His legs, shaking with exhaustion, could carry him no further. The realization was a heavy weight on his chest, a suffocating truth that flooded his mind with dread. He had been so close, so sure that he had found a way out, but now the mountain was closing in on him once more. His breath came in shallow, quick gasps, a futile attempt to ward off the panic that was threatening to consume him. The ground beneath his feet cracked with a sickening sound, a deep rumble that seemed to echo from the very heart of Everest. Jordan's eyes shot upward as the towering cliffs seemed to shift, revealing something he had not noticed before: hidden faces, etched in stone, staring down at him. The mountain was alive, not in the way that the whispers had tried to convince him, but in a far more terrifying way. The mountain had always been alive, its rocks, ice, and snow a mask for the ancient, unseen forces that lay dormant beneath its surface. The figures carved into the mountain were not merely decorative. They were watching him, waiting for him to understand. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as the realization dawned. The mountain was not just a place. It was a guardian, a sentient being that had absorbed the souls of those who had dared to climb its heights. Each figure carved into the rocks was a reminder of those who had fallen, whose lives had been consumed by the mountain's relentless hunger. He was not the first to fall victim to its power, and he would not be the last. The air grew even colder, the temperature dropping sharply as though the mountain itself were closing in on him. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the whispers returned, now so loud that they reverberated in his very bones. He clutched his head, feeling the pressure of their voices, their demands, their promises of release. But there was no release. There was only the mountain and the unending hunger of those who had come before him. Jordan had thought he could break free. He had thought that by understanding the mountain's tricks, he could escape its clutches. But now he understood that the mountain was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a prison, an eternal prison for those who dared to seek its summit. There was no escape from the mountain, no way to outrun its pull. It was a place where all who entered were doomed to become part of its twisted, living history. The ground beneath him cracked again, wider this time. The snow and ice shifted, revealing a gaping chasm that stretched deep into the mountain's core. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he peered into the darkness below, the cold air rising from the abyss, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. It was as if the mountain had opened its mouth to swallow him whole. But just as he thought he would be pulled into the darkness, something unexpected happened. The figures carved into the cliffs began to move, not physically but within his mind. They seemed to beckon to him, their eyes following him with a mixture of pity and understanding. It was a moment of recognition. The mountain had been here long before him, and it would remain long after. It was not a force to be fought against, but something that had to be accepted, something that required surrender. In that moment, Jordan understood the final lesson EVEREST had for him. The mountain was not his enemy, nor was it his savior. It was an inevitable part of the cycle of life, a place where souls came to rest. There was no escaping it, only accepting it. The voices had not been lies. They had been warnings, the last remnants of those who had come before him, now part of the mountain, now part of him. Jordan felt a sense of peace settle over him as he stood there, staring into the abyss. His fear had melted away, replaced by a quiet resignation. The mountain had claimed him, but not in the way he had feared. He was no longer fighting against it. He had become part of it, as all those before him had. His journey, though it had been filled with pain and terror, had finally come to an end. The ground trembled once more, but this time it was not a warning. It was the mountain's final embrace, a welcome into the cold, eternal dark. Jordan closed his eyes, his final breath stolen by the howling winds of EVEREST, as his soul joined the countless others who had fallen victim to the mountain's unyielding will. And so, the mountain waited, its ancient hunger satisfied once again, as it quietly began to reclaim its new soul. When the rescue teams finally reached Everest Peak, they found nothing. No body, no remnants, no sign of Jordan. Just the same stark, impassable landscape that had claimed so many others before him. They searched the slopes and crevices, scanned the shifting snow, and reached out across the frozen expanse with technology and human perseverance. But there was no trace of the man who had set out with such determination weeks before, no sign of his struggle, no echo of the once promising hope he had clung to during his descent. The mountain had swallowed him whole, as it had done countless times before. This was the paradox of Mount Everest, its allure and its terror. It drew adventurers, climbers, thrill-seekers, and dreamers from all over the world. But it had no mercy. It was a place of extremes, both physical and spiritual, where the human will was tested against an environment that neither understood nor cared for human ambition. The mountain was ancient, far older than any of the fleeting lives that dared to climb it, and it had its own rules that Jordan, like so many others, had failed to comprehend in time. In the weeks following the search, an eerie silence descended upon the mountaineering community. The whispers about Jordan's disappearance turned into speculation, into half-hearted rumors, and then, finally, into uneasy acceptance. The mountain had claimed him, and it would claim others. It always did, but no one dared to speak of what they thought had truly happened. It was too unsettling to entertain the possibility that the mountain, in its own way, was more than just a massive, dangerous peak of rock and ice. That it had a will, a presence that lingered long after the climbers had gone. and that it had its own reasons for taking lives. The people closest to Jordan, his family, his friends, his fellow climbers, continued to mourn, but they did so quietly. There was no closure, no final moment of release, no body to bury. They would go on with their lives, carrying the unspoken weight of his disappearance. But the haunting question of whether Jordan had ever truly left Everest lingered in the air, like the cold that seemed to stretch beyond the reaches of the summit. As the seasons shifted and another year passed, life continued its slow, inevitable march. The world moved on from Jordan's story, just as it always did with those who met their fate on Everest. New climbers arrived and old ones left, some having made peace with the mountain, others still hoping to conquer it. But the question of what truly happened to Jordan remained. For those who had followed his journey from the beginning, it was impossible to forget. The whispers, faint but persistent, spoke of the strange force that had surrounded his descent, the warm wind that had momentarily pulled him away from the mountain's frozen grip. Was it an illusion? A hallucination brought on by the altitude, the exhaustion, or something far darker? Some began to wonder if Jordan had been touched by something beyond human comprehension. Had the mountain, in some twisted sense, reached out to him? Was it possible that the whispers that Jordan had heard, the strange voices and the faces carved into the rock, were not merely figments of a tired mind, but something more? What if the mountain was not simply a geographical feature, but a living, breathing entity, one that could speak to the climbers who dared to venture too far? And what if it could take them, not just their lives, but their very souls? The idea of the mountain as a being rather than a place, began to take root in the minds of those who studied it. Some believed it was merely superstition. Others, those who had spent years in the mountains, who had felt the pull of its winds and the shifting of its glaciers, found themselves questioning their own understanding. For the first time, the mountain's mystique seemed to grow in the darkness of Jordan's absence, as if the very peaks of Everest held secrets that no one could fully comprehend. But for all the questions that had emerged in the wake of his disappearance, no answer could be found. The records of Jordan's final days, his notes, his photos, the video recordings, offered little clarity. The warm wind that had swept across his path seemed like